The Mediterranean sun bathed the quiet streets of Sliema that October morning in 1995, while tourists walked carelessly along the coastal avenues of Malta. It was October 26th when Fatih Shakaki left the Diplomat Hotel, breathing the salty Mediterranean air and observing the boats that dotted the blue horizon. To any casual observer, he was just another visitor, enjoying the serenity of one of the smallest European nations, a neutral archipelago strategically situated between Sicily and the North African coast. The man walking with relaxed steps on the stone sidewalks showed no sign of nervousness or urgency. Wearing discreet clothing and carrying false documentation that identified him as Dr. Ibrahim Ali Shawesh, a Syrian doctor in transit, he perfectly personified the figure of a liberal professional on a business trip. Malta represented only a technical stopover on his journey back from Libya to Syria, a strategic stop that would allow him to reorganize his next moves without arousing the suspicion of Western authorities. The small island state, a member of the European Union since the previous decade, offered the perfect combination of political neutrality and Mediterranean connectivity that made it possible to move discreetly between different theaters of operation in the Middle East and North Africa. However, that apparent normality concealed a much more complex and dangerous reality. The man who identified himself as Dr. Shawesh was in fact one of the most wanted figures by Israeli intelligence services, a revolutionary leader whose influence extended from the refugee camps of Gaza to the centers of power in Tehran. Fatih Shakaki had transformed a nascent Palestinian organization into one of the main threats to Israel's security, establishing direct operational connections with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and developing a doctrine that combined radical Palestinian nationalism with Shiite Islamic fundamentalism. His activities were not limited to inflammatory rhetoric or the theoretical planning of future actions. Under his leadership, Palestinian Islamic Jihad had executed a series of devastating attacks that resulted in dozens of Israeli civilian casualties, establishing a pattern of violence that directly challenged the fragile peace processes that were emerging in the 1990s. The choice of Malta as a transit location was not a coincidence, but the result of a precise strategic calculation that took into account the operational limitations of local security forces and the relative freedom of movement that the Maltese status of neutrality provided to individuals in transit. At that precise moment, while Shakaki walked through the sunny streets of Sliema, multiple forces converged around him without him demonstrating any awareness of the imminent danger. Agents from the Mossad, the legendary Israeli intelligence service, had mounted a meticulously planned operation that combined sophisticated electronic surveillance, human infiltration, and complex logistical coordination to definitively neutralize the one they considered one of the main architects of contemporary Palestinian terrorism. The operation had been authorized at the highest levels of the Israeli government and represented the culmination of months of intelligence work that involved tracking financial movements, intercepting communications, and developing a network of informants that allowed for precisely mapping the target's habits and vulnerabilities. The choice of time and location reflected not only immediate tactical considerations, but also a broader geopolitical calculation about the diplomatic consequences of executing an elimination operation on European territory, far from the traditional conflict theaters of the Middle East, where such actions could be more easily justified as legitimate self-defense. The atmosphere of tranquility that characterized that Maltese morning was about to be violently interrupted by a brutal demonstration of the Israeli operational capacity to project lethal power beyond its traditional geographical borders. Two motorcyclists approached with the mechanical precision of highly trained professionals, their faces hidden by helmets that prevented any subsequent identification. The attack was executed with a chilling efficiency that evidenced years of specialized preparation in selective elimination operations, each movement calculated to maximize lethal effectiveness while minimizing the operational exposure of the executors. The shots echoed through the historic streets of Sliema as a brutal intrusion of the geopolitical reality of the Middle East into the quiet Mediterranean routine, instantly transforming a tourist district into the scene of an international political assassination. In a matter of seconds, the attackers disappeared into the labyrinthine alleys of the old city, leaving behind only the inert body of one of the most influential terrorist leaders of his generation and a small, neutral nation suddenly confronted with the consequences of its strategic geographical position. The silence that followed the shots was gradually broken by the screams of shocked passers-by, ambulance sirens, and the start of an investigation that would quickly reveal the international dimension of that crime. Malta awoke that October afternoon to the uncomfortable reality that even the smallest and apparently most irrelevant nations can be involuntarily dragged into the center of conflicts that transcend their borders and capabilities. The assassination of Fatih Shaqaqi in the streets of Sliema represented not only the physical elimination of an individual, but the violent materialization of geopolitical tensions that had been accumulating since the end of the Cold War and the emergence of new patterns of asymmetric conflict in the Middle East. The Mossad operation on Maltese territory established a disturbing precedent about the limits of national sovereignty in a world where state actors with advanced intelligence capabilities can execute lethal operations practically anywhere on the globe, challenging the traditional norms of international law and interstate diplomacy. The Maltese authorities found themselves confronted with an unprecedented situation that demanded responses both at the level of domestic criminal investigation and within the scope of international diplomacy, as they tried to balance the contradictory pressures exerted by different regional and global actors interested in the case. The news of the assassination spread rapidly through international media, generating shockwaves that propagated from government offices in Jerusalem and Ramallah to the meeting rooms of international organizations in New York and Geneva. For Israel, the operation represented another success in the long tradition of preventive actions aimed at neutralizing terrorist threats before they could materialize into new attacks against Israeli civilians. For Palestinian organizations, Shaqaqi's death constituted another demonstration of the impunity with which Israel conducted extrajudicial assassinations in international territory, systematically violating the basic principles of state sovereignty and international law. The international community was divided between those who saw the operation as a legitimate response to international terrorism and those who condemned it as an unacceptable violation of the norms governing relations between civilized states. The Shaqaqi case thus became an enduring symbol of the moral and legal ambiguities that characterize the fight against terrorism in a globalized world, where the traditional boundaries between internal and external security become increasingly diffuse and controversial. To truly understand the ramifications of this extraordinary event that shook tranquil Malta that October 1995, it becomes essential to examine in detail the personal and political trajectory of the man who became the target of one of the most audacious elimination operations in the modern history of the Mossad. Fatih Shaqaqi did not emerge from a vacuum as a one-dimensional terrorist figure, but represented the complex product of decades of political radicalization, sophisticated intellectual formation, and traumatic experiences that shaped his worldview and strategic choices. Born in 1951 in the city of Rafah, located on the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt, Shaqaqi grew up in a family of Palestinian refugees who had lost their ancestral lands during the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. His parents, originally from the village of Zarnuka, were forced to abandon their properties and traditional livelihoods, joining the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who became permanent refugees in neighboring Arab territories. This formative experience of forced displacement and loss of family patrimony established the psychological and ideological foundations that would later influence his radical political evolution. The young Fatih demonstrated exceptional intelligence and a remarkable capacity for academic studies from an early age, particularly excelling in the areas of mathematics and physics during his school years. This intellectual aptitude provided him with educational opportunities that eventually led him to Egypt, where he studied medicine and specialized in pediatrics, developing professional competencies that would allow him to establish a respectable career in childcare. During his university years in Cairo, Shaqaqi was exposed to a rich tradition of Arab political thought that combined secular nationalism, pan-Arab socialism, and various currents of political Islam that were emerging as alternatives to the failure of Arab nationalist regimes to effectively confront Israel. The devastating defeat of the Arab armies in the 1967 Six-Day War, which resulted in the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, had a profound impact on the generation of young Arab intellectuals like Shakaki, convincing them that traditional political and military strategies had completely failed to reverse what they perceived as the fundamental historical injustice represented by the existence of Israel. It was precisely in this context of disillusionment with conventional political approaches that Shakaki began to explore more radical ideological alternatives, particularly the works of Islamist theorists such as Hassan al-Banna, founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Sayyid Qutb, whose radical interpretations of political Islam provided religious justifications for armed resistance against governments considered illegitimate or foreign occupation. The Iranian Revolution of 1979, which overthrew the pro-Western regime of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and established an Islamic Republic under the leadership of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, represented for Shakaki a moment of political epiphany that demonstrated the practical possibility of overthrowing established regimes through popular mobilization based on revolutionary Islamic principles. The Iranian success in expelling a regional power supported by the United States and establishing a political system based on Islamic law provided an inspiring model for young Arab radicals who had lost faith in the secular ideologies that dominated Arab political thought during the preceding decades. Shakaki's fascination with the Iranian revolutionary experience led him to write a book entitled Khomeini, The Islamic Solution and the Alternative, a work that analyzed in detail the strategies used by the Iranian Shiite clergy to mobilize the popular masses against the Shah's regime and establish a new political order based on Islamic principles. The book, which circulated clandestinely among circles of students and Arab activists, proposed the application of similar methods to the Palestinian context, arguing that only a genuine Islamic revolution could liberate Palestine from Zionist occupation and establish an Islamic state that would serve as a base for the complete liberation of the Holy Land. The Egyptian authorities, alarmed by the subversive potential of this work, quickly banned it and began a campaign of repression against Shakaki and his associates, forcing him to operate underground and eventually seek refuge in other Arab territories where his political activities could continue without governmental interference. This repression only reinforced his convictions about the corrupt nature of existing Arab regimes and the necessity of overthrowing not only Israel, but also the Arab governments that collaborated with the West to the detriment of genuine Islamic interests. In 1981, Shakaki took the decisive step of translating his political theories into practical action, founding together with Abdel Aziz Auda the organization that would become known as Palestinian Islamic Jihad. This new organization represented an innovative synthesis between traditional Palestinian nationalism and revolutionary Islamism, inspired by the Iranian model, establishing as its central objective not only the liberation of historical Palestine, but the complete transformation of the regional political order through the elimination of Israel and the establishment of an Islamic caliphate that would eventually extend throughout the Muslim world. Unlike Yasser Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization, which maintained a fundamentally secular orientation and demonstrated a growing willingness to negotiate political solutions with Israel, Palestinian Islamic Jihad categorically rejected any form of territorial or political compromise, considering all of historical Palestine as inalienable Islamic territory that should be liberated through sustained armed struggle until final victory. This uncompromising position placed the organization in direct conflict not only with Israel, but also with sectors of the Palestinian leadership that demonstrated a willingness to accept solutions based on the coexistence of two states in the region. The strategic approach developed by Shakaki combined intellectual sophistication with tactical brutality, establishing the religious legitimacy for methods of struggle that specifically included attacks against Israeli civilians as a way to pressure the Jewish state to abandon the occupied territories. Under his theoretical and operational leadership, Palestinian Islamic Jihad developed a doctrine of total resistance that religiously justified the use of terrorist tactics, including suicide attacks, as a legitimate form of jihad against foreign occupiers of Muslim territory. This approach represented a significant escalation in relation to the methods traditionally used by Palestinian resistance movements, introducing elements of religious fanaticism that made militants willing to sacrifice their own lives in operations aimed at maximizing psychological terror among the Israeli civilian population. The combination of extreme religious motivation with access to professional military training and substantial financial resources provided by regional sponsors quickly transformed Palestinian Islamic Jihad into one of the most serious terrorist threats faced by Israel since its founding. The period of the 1990s brought fundamental geopolitical transformations that dramatically altered the context in which both Israel and Palestinian organizations operated, creating new opportunities for peace negotiations, but also intensifying tensions between those who supported diplomatic solutions and those who remained committed to armed struggle until final victory. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 eliminated one of the main sources of political and military support for secular Palestinian organizations, forcing leaders like Yasser Arafat to reconsider their strategies and seek diplomatic alternatives to achieve Palestinian political objectives. Simultaneously, the decisive victory of the international coalition led by the United States in the 1991 Gulf War demonstrated Western military supremacy and created a new regional power configuration that favored peace initiatives sponsored by the American superpower. It was in this context of profound structural changes that the Oslo process emerged, a series of secret negotiations between Israeli and Palestinian representatives that culminated in the historic Oslo Accords of 1993, representing the first time in the history of the conflict that both parties formally committed to seeking a negotiated solution based on mutual recognition and territorial division. The signing of the Oslo Accords at the White House in September 1993, symbolized by the famous handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat under the benevolent gaze of President Bill Clinton, generated a wave of international optimism about the prospects for lasting peace in the Middle East. The agreements established a gradual timeline for the transfer of administrative control over parts of the occupied territories to a new Palestinian authority led by Arafat, creating the basis for future negotiations on fundamental issues such as the status of Jerusalem, the fate of Palestinian refugees, and the definitive borders between Israel and an eventual Palestinian state. For many international observers, Oslo represented the triumph of diplomacy over violence, and the demonstration that even the most intractable conflicts could be resolved through patient negotiations and mutual compromises. The international community mobilized substantial financial resources to support the peace process, establishing economic assistance programs aimed at improving the living conditions of the Palestinian population and creating material incentives for popular support for the peace accords. However, this initial euphoria about the prospects for peace quickly confronted the reality that significant sectors of both Israeli and Palestinian society categorically rejected the fundamental premises of the Oslo Accords. On the Israeli side, religious settler groups and right-wing political parties denounced the accords as a dangerous capitulation that jeopardized Israel's security and violated biblical mandates on the Jewish possession of the Holy Land. On the Palestinian side, organizations like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad characterized Oslo as a historical betrayal that legitimized the Zionist occupation and abandoned the fundamental objective of liberating all of historical Palestine. For leaders like Fatih Shakaki, the Oslo Accords did not represent a step toward Palestinian justice, but rather a diplomatic trap that would divide the Palestinian national movement and allow Israel to consolidate its occupation of substantial parts of historical Palestine under the guise of an international peace process. This perception led rejectionist organizations to intensify their campaigns of violence as a way to sabotage the peace process and demonstrate the impossibility of achieving security through territorial concessions. Palestinian Islamic Jihad's response to the Oslo Accords consisted of a systematic escalation of terrorist attacks aimed at undermining Israeli public confidence in the peace process and forcing the Rabin government to abandon negotiations with the Palestinians. Under the ideological inspiration of Shakaki and the operational direction of military commanders trained in Lebanon and Iran, the organization developed a campaign of suicide attacks that specifically targeted concentrations of Israeli civilians on buses, markets, restaurants, and other public places. These operations, often executed by young Palestinians willing to sacrifice their lives in exchange for the promise of religious martyrdom, caused hundreds of civilian casualties and created a climate of terror among the Israeli population that fundamentally questioned the wisdom of making territorial concessions in exchange for promises of peace. Each successful attack strengthened the position of Israeli opponents of the Oslo process, who argued that Palestinians used the negotiations as a smokescreen to prepare new attacks against Israel, and weakened the position of Israeli leaders who advocated the need to take risks for peace. The situation was further complicated by the growing support that Palestinian Islamic Jihad received from the Iranian regime, which viewed the Oslo process as a direct threat to its strategic regional interests. Iran, which had emerged from the war with Iraq as an ambitious regional power determined to expand its influence throughout the Middle East, considered any normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab world as a fundamental obstacle to its objectives of establishing regional hegemony based on revolutionary Islamic principles. Through organizations like the Lebanese Hezbollah and radical Palestinian groups, Tehran developed a network of regional proxies aimed at sabotaging peace initiatives and keeping the Middle East in a state of permanent conflict that would prevent the consolidation of the pro-Western regional order. Iranian funding allowed Palestinian Islamic Jihad to significantly expand its operational capabilities, acquiring sophisticated weaponry, establishing training camps, and developing networks of terrorist cells that operated not only in the Palestinian territories, but also in neighboring Arab countries and even on Israeli territory. Fathi Shaqaqi gradually emerged as a central figure in this network of regional resistance, establishing direct operational connections with commanders of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and developing tactical doctrines that combined traditional guerrilla methods with technological innovations aimed at maximizing the psychological impact of terrorist attacks. His frequent travels between Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran allowed him to coordinate complex operational strategies that involved multiple theaters of operation and various affiliated organizations, transforming him into one of the main architects of the regional Islamic resistance against Israel and its Western allies. Israeli intelligence began to perceive Shaqaqi not merely as the leader of a specific terrorist organization, but as the strategic coordinator of a broad anti-Israeli coalition that fundamentally threatened the security of the Jewish state and the stability of the entire region. This perception eventually led to the decision to eliminate Shaqaqi as a way to dismantle the operational network he had built and send a deterrent message to other terrorist leaders who considered expanding their operations against Israeli targets. The Israeli decision to eliminate Fathi Shaqaqi represented the culmination of a complex process of strategic deliberation that involved the highest echelons of the government, security apparatus, and intelligence community of the Jewish state. This decision was not made impulsively or emotionally, but resulted from a meticulous analysis of the threats represented by Palestinian Islamic Jihad under Shaqaqi's leadership and a careful evaluation of the various options available to neutralize these threats. The Israeli decision-making process took into account not only the immediate operational capabilities of the organization, but also its potential for future growth should Shaqaqi succeed in consolidating his regional alliances and expanding his financing and training networks. Israeli intelligence analysis concluded that Shaqaqi represented a qualitatively different threat from other Palestinian leaders due to his unique combination of intellectual sophistication, international connections, and uncompromising commitment to terrorist methods that deliberately aim to maximize Israeli civilian casualties. The planning of the elimination operation involved months of preparatory work that combined sophisticated electronic surveillance, development of human sources, and complex logistical coordination between different units of the Israeli intelligence apparatus. The Mossad, responsible for conducting operations abroad, worked in close collaboration with other Israeli intelligence agencies to meticulously map Shaqaqi's movements, identify his behavior patterns, and locate operational vulnerabilities that could be exploited to successfully execute the elimination. This planning phase also involved the careful analysis of diplomatic and political considerations related to executing a lethal operation on European territory, including assessments of the likely reactions of European governments, international organizations, and world public opinion. Israeli planners concluded that the strategic benefits of eliminating Shakaki outweighed the potential diplomatic costs, especially considering that Malta was a small country with limited criminal investigation capabilities and restricted international influence. The choice of Malta as the location for the operation reflected several tactical and strategic considerations that made the small island nation particularly suitable for an elimination operation. First, Malta offered relative ease of access and exfiltration due to its Mediterranean connectivity and proximity to other European countries where Israeli agents could seek refuge after completing the operation. Second, Maltese security forces had limited experience in investigating complex international crimes, reducing the probabilities that the operation would be detected before its execution or that its perpetrators would be identified and captured later. Third, Malta maintained relatively limited diplomatic relations with Arab countries and Palestinian organizations, minimizing the political pressures that the Maltese government would face to conduct rigorous investigations or seek retaliation against Israel. Fourth, the Maltese population had little knowledge about the complexities of the Arab-Israeli conflict, reducing the probabilities that the operation would generate significant popular protests or campaigns of solidarity with the Palestinian cause that could complicate Israeli diplomatic relations with Europe. The operation itself was executed with the characteristic precision of Mossad elite units, demonstrating years of specialized training in selective eliminations and rapid exfiltration from hostile territories. The operational team, composed of highly trained agents with previous experience in similar operations, had spent weeks studying Shakaki's movements in Malta, identifying his preferred routes, times of activity, and personal security measures. The assassins used motorcycles as an attack platform due to their superior mobility in an urban environment, capacity for rapid approach to the target, and ease of escape through the dense traffic of Maltese streets. The weapons used were specifically selected to maximize the probability of instant death of the target, while minimizing the risk of injury to innocent bystanders, demonstrating operational professionalism that distinguishes state intelligence operations from indiscriminate terrorist actions. The precise execution of the operation, without collateral casualties and with successful exfiltration of all agents involved, established new standards of operational excellence that would influence future elimination operations conducted by intelligence agencies worldwide. The immediate consequences of Fatih Shakaki's assassination manifested in multiple dimensions that affected not only the organizations directly involved in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but also international diplomatic relations and the development of legal norms on transnational intelligence operations. For Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the loss of its founding leader and main ideologue represented a devastating blow that forced the organization to undergo an extensive period of internal reorganization and strategic redefinition. Shakaki was not only the operational commander of the organization, but also its main theoretician and the primary source of religious legitimacy for its terrorist activities. His elimination created a leadership vacuum that none of his immediate lieutenants was adequately prepared to fill, leading to internal disputes over succession and strategic direction that temporarily weakened the operational capacity of the organization. This period of organizational instability coincided with an intensification of Israeli pressure on Palestinian Islamic Jihad cells in the occupied territories, including mass arrests, house demolitions, and other punitive measures aimed at capitalizing on the group's temporary disorganization to dismantle its operational infrastructure. Shakaki's death also generated significant tensions within the regional alliance he had built between Palestinian Islamic Jihad and external sponsors such as Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. These regional actors had invested substantial resources in the development of the organization as an instrument to advance their strategic objectives in the region, and the sudden elimination of their main Palestinian interlocutor complicated their calculations about how to continue supporting the Islamic resistance against Israel. The Iranian government in particular faced dilemmas about whether it should intensify its support for Palestinian organizations as a way to retaliate against Israel for the assassination of a close ally, or whether it should temporarily reduce its profile in the Palestinian conflict to avoid provoking new Israeli operations against Iranian targets. Syria, which had allowed Shakaki to operate from its territory, found itself confronted with Israeli pressures to expel other Palestinian leaders or face possible military retaliation, complicating the Assad regime's calculations about how to balance its relations with different regional actors. In the sphere of international diplomacy, Shakaki's assassination on Maltese territory generated controversy about the legal limits of legitimate self-defense in international law and the extent to which states can execute elimination operations against citizens of third countries in the territory of nations not directly involved in conflicts. The Maltese government, confronted with the flagrant violation of its territorial sovereignty, initiated criminal investigations and demanded explanations from Israel about its alleged responsibility for the operation, establishing a precedent for how small European nations should respond to unauthorized intelligence operations on their territory. Although Israel never officially assumed responsibility for Shakaki's elimination, circumstantial evidence was strong enough for most international observers to attribute the operation to the Mossad, creating diplomatic tensions between Israel and several European countries that demanded guarantees about the future respect of their territorial sovereignty. These tensions were subsequently managed through discreet diplomatic channels that allowed both parties to avoid public escalations while establishing understandings about the limits of Israeli intelligence operations on European territory. The reaction of Palestinian organizations to Shakaki's assassination included not only condemnation statements and promises of retaliation, but also attempts to politically capitalize on the operation as additional evidence of the terrorist nature of the Israeli state. Palestinian leaders argued that Shakaki's elimination on neutral territory demonstrated Israel's systematic disrespect for international norms and its willingness to use indiscriminate violence against Palestinian leaders regardless of legal or diplomatic considerations. This narrative was amplified through Arab media networks and Palestinian solidarity organizations in Western countries, contributing to international campaigns aimed at isolating Israel diplomatically and characterizing it as an outlaw state that operated with impunity beyond the restrictions of international law. Paradoxically, these campaigns also contributed to increasing Shakaki's prestige within radical Palestinian circles, transforming him into a symbol of resistance and martyrdom that would inspire future generations of Palestinian activists to continue their struggle against Israel. The transformation of Fathi Shakaki from an operational terrorist leader into a symbolic martyr represented an unintended consequence of the Israeli operation that illustrates the strategic complexities of selective elimination policies. Although Shakaki's physical death removed an immediate operational threat, it also created a powerful symbol that radical Palestinian organizations used to mobilize popular support and legitimize future terrorist operations as a way to avenge his assassination. Photographs of Shakaki began to appear in Palestinian demonstrations, propaganda materials, and recruitment centers, while his statements and writings were compiled into collections that circulated widely among radicalized young Palestinians. The mythology that developed around his death included narratives about his personal courage, dedication to the Palestinian cause, and willingness to sacrifice his life for the liberation of Palestine. Elements that contributed to his status as an inspiration for future suicide operations and other forms of Palestinian violence against Israel. The question of the long-term effectiveness of the Maltese operation continued to be debated within Israeli intelligence circles and international security analysts during the decades subsequent to the assassination. Although Shakaki's elimination achieved its immediate tactical objectives of neutralizing a specific threat and demonstrating the Israeli capacity to reach enemies anywhere in the world, its strategic effectiveness remained questionable due to the continuation of Palestinian Islamic Jihad's activities under new leadership and the persistence of the regional networks that Shakaki had established. The organization eventually reorganized under the leadership of Ramadan Abdullah Shala and later Ziad al-Nakhala, maintaining its fundamental ideological commitments and continuing to execute terrorist operations against Israeli targets. Iranian support for the organization not only continued after Shakaki's death, but in fact increased during certain periods as a way to indirectly retaliate against Israel for the elimination of a close ally. This organizational and operational continuity raised questions about whether selective elimination policies truly eliminate terrorist threats or simply force these organizations to adapt and evolve in ways that may eventually make them more resilient and effective. The decades that followed Fatih Shakaki's assassination in Malta witnessed complex and often contradictory developments that shed new light on the long-term consequences of that audacious Mossad operation. Palestinian Islamic Jihad, far from disintegrating after the loss of its founding leader, demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation and renewal that allowed not only its organizational survival, but also a significant expansion of its operational capabilities during the subsequent years. Under the leadership of Ramadan Abdullah Shala, who took command of the organization in 1995 and maintained close ties with Iranian sponsors, Palestinian Islamic Jihad underwent a process of institutionalization that transformed it from a relatively small personalized group around Shakaki into a more structured and resilient organization capable of surviving the elimination of individual leaders. This process included the development of more decentralized command structures, more sophisticated recruitment mechanisms, and more diversified financing networks that reduced the organization's dependence on specific charismatic figures and increased its ability to resist Israeli dismantling operations. During the Second Intifada, 2000-2005, Palestinian Islamic Jihad emerged as one of the main organizations responsible for suicide attacks against Israeli civilian targets, demonstrating that its operational capacity had not only recovered from the loss of Shakaki, but had in fact expanded significantly. The organization executed dozens of devastating terrorist operations during this period, including attacks against buses, restaurants, shopping centers, and other public places that resulted in hundreds of Israeli casualties. These operations were notable not only for their frequency and lethality, but also for the growing technical sophistication that demonstrated access to advanced military training and enhanced explosive technologies provided by regional sponsors. Palestinian Islamic Jihad's ability to maintain sustained operations during a period of intensive Israeli military pressure demonstrated that Shakaki's elimination had failed to achieve the strategic objective of permanently neutralizing the threat represented by the organization. The growing role of Iran as the main sponsor of Palestinian Islamic Jihad after Shakaki's death illustrated how selective elimination policies can generate unintended consequences that amplify rather than diminish long-term threats. The Iranian regime, determined to demonstrate that the elimination of Palestinian allies would not deter its support for the Islamic resistance, substantially increased its investment in the organization as a way to indirectly retaliate against Israel and maintain a strategic presence in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This expanded support included not only increased funding, but also the transfer of advanced military technologies, including long-range rockets, encrypted communication systems, and explosive manufacturing techniques that significantly transformed the organization's operational capabilities. The Iranian connection also provided Palestinian Islamic Jihad with access to international procurement and training networks that operated in multiple countries and allowed the organization to develop capabilities that largely transcended its origins as a local Palestinian group. The evolution of Palestinian Islamic Jihad's military capabilities became particularly evident during subsequent conflicts between Israel and Palestinian organizations in the Gaza Strip, where the organization demonstrated the capacity to launch rockets against Israeli cities, located dozens of kilometers away. During Israeli military operations such as Cast Lead, 2008-2009, Pillar of Defense, 2012, and Protective Edge, 2014, Palestinian Islamic Jihad actively participated in the fighting, launching thousands of projectiles against Israeli territory and forcing the temporary displacement of hundreds of thousands of Israeli civilians. This escalation of capabilities represented a fundamental qualitative transformation in relation to the organization's activities during the Shakaki era, when its operations were mainly limited to suicide attacks and other forms of urban terrorism. The ability to conduct sustained artillery operations against Israeli territory elevated Palestinian Islamic Jihad to the status of a regional military threat that required Israeli strategic responses comparable to those used against hostile states rather than merely non-state terrorist groups. The persistence and evolution of Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the decades after Shakaki's elimination raised fundamental questions about the effectiveness of Israeli selective elimination policies as an instrument of strategic counter-terrorism. Although these operations consistently achieved their tactical objectives of neutralizing specific threats and demonstrating deterrent capabilities, their contribution to broader strategic goals of reducing terrorist threats remained ambiguous and controversial. Critics argued that selective elimination policies produced cycles of radicalization and retaliation that perpetuated rather than resolved long-term conflicts, while defenders maintained that these operations were essential to prevent immediate terrorist attacks and maintain psychological pressure on hostile organizations. The experience of Palestinian Islamic Jihad suggested that well-structured and externally supported terrorist organizations possessed an adaptive capacity that allowed them to survive and evolve in response to military and intelligence pressures, questioning fundamental premises about the possibility of definitively defeating terrorist threats through purely military methods. The transformation of the Middle East itself during the decades after 1995 created new contexts that influenced both the activities of Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Israeli responses to Palestinian terrorist threats. The American invasion of Iraq in 2003 and its destabilizing consequences, the Arab Spring initiated in 2010 and its political reverberations, and the growth of organizations like the Islamic State dramatically altered the regional strategic scenario in ways that affected all actors involved in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. For Palestinian Islamic Jihad, these developments offered both opportunities and challenges, including access to new sources of funding and recruitment, but also intensified competition for resources and attention with more visible jihadist organizations operating in other regional theaters. For Israel, the proliferation of regional terrorist threats forced a re-evaluation of strategic priorities that included consideration of whether Palestinian groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad represented primary or secondary threats compared to emerging challenges such as the Iranian nuclear program and Syrian instability. The retrospective analysis of the 1995 Maltese operation, in light of subsequent developments, revealed both the powers and the limitations of intelligence operations as instruments of foreign policy and national security. On the one hand, the operation demonstrated impressive operational capabilities that set standards of technical excellence and sent powerful deterrent messages to other adversaries of Israel. The Mossad's capacity to locate, track, and eliminate a specific target on European territory, far from the traditional conflict theaters of the Middle East, illustrated intelligence sophistication and power projection that few states possessed and that contributed to Israel's reputation as a formidable security actor, capable of defending its interests globally. On the other hand, the persistence of Palestinian Islamic Jihad as a significant operational threat during the decades after Shakaki's elimination demonstrated that tactical successes in intelligence operations do not necessarily translate into lasting strategic victories, especially when hostile organizations have access to regional support networks that allow them to reconstitute themselves after leadership losses. The question of the moral and legal legitimacy of operations like Shakaki's elimination continued to generate academic, political, and legal debates that reflected broader tensions about the balance between national security and international norms in an era of transnational terrorist threats. Defenders of such operations argued that democratic states facing genuine terrorist threats possessed legitimate self-defense rights that justified preventive actions against individuals directly responsible for planning and executing attacks against innocent civilians. Critics responded that allowing states to conduct extrajudicial executions on the territory of third countries established dangerous precedents that could be exploited by authoritarian regimes to justify assassinations of political dissidents and opponents under the pretext of combating terrorism. These tensions were amplified by the fact that definitions of terrorism remained controversial and often dependent on specific political perspectives, making it difficult to establish objective criteria for determining when selective elimination operations were justified rather than simply convenient for states with the necessary operational capabilities. The final legacy of the 1995 Maltese operation remains complex and ambivalent, reflecting the inherent ambiguities of combating terrorism in an international system theoretically based on respect for state sovereignty and the rule of law, but practically confronted with non-state actors that operate across borders and defy traditional categories of interstate conflict. Fathi Shakaki's elimination represents a paradigmatic case of the possibilities and limitations of military power, applied with surgical precision against specific threats, simultaneously demonstrating impressive technical capabilities and inconclusive strategic results that illustrate the irreducible complexity of prolonged conflicts rooted in historical grievances, collective identities, and competing narratives about justice and legitimacy. 3 decades after that sunny afternoon in Malta, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict remains unresolved. Palestinian Islamic Jihad remains active as a military organization, and the questions raised by the operation about the ethical and legal limits of state action against terrorism remain as relevant as when the first shots echoed through the quiet streets of Sliema.